We apologize for the difficulties with sound in parts of the interview. The internet connection was fading in and out. We have placed captions on some of those areas. So let me welcome you to the Kilby Center Online Summit, Radical Recovery Summit. And why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about you, your work, whatever you want to share right now.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Kimber Olsen, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I live and practice in Anchorage, Alaska. I have a clinic where I'm the executive and clinical director of that really focuses on working with complex trauma and disease. And so because of that, we also have some expertise in substance abuse and eating disorders and self-harm type of activities, looking at all of the ways that instead of being, kind of siloed, really working together with all of the different aspects of trauma and how that impacts us.
How did you get involved in that?
My very first professional job was working with Alaska Native and American Indian girls ages 10 to 16. In order to be referred to our program, we had to be prostituting, gang involved, homeless, in and out of psychiatric hospitals, and have some allegations of sexual abuse. And the goal of the program was to prevent the birth of babies with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, because we knew the correlation between sexual abuse and subsequent substance use was so high. That was really the goal. So while we were doing a tertiary kind of intervention, we were also looking at prevention at the same time. That was my very first job, actually, prior to graduate school. And then I worked in that capacity once I graduated with my master's degree as well.
Wow, that sounds like a very intense job.
It was very intense. I loved it. I got to do all kinds of things that were really different, I think, than some people get to experience. I did an entire year of therapy one time with a young lady who was too nervous to come into the office because of a number of reasons, but we did therapy at Wendy's in the back corner until she was ready to come into the office. So obviously there's a lot of work but really it was just that safety and stabilization and building that relationship to move into a different place. I got to do a lot of really wonderful and different kind of work in that setting.
And so addiction must have been one of the real prevalent themes for women and young girls in that situation.
It was. We looked at our own statistics and did a little bit of our own research. And what we found was that in the majority of cases, the girls who came into our program, we asked them at what age did they start to be sexually abused, and then at what age, if at all, did they use any substances. And a number of them we found actually were given substances by their perpetrators to make them more easily accessible and perpetrated on.
Right.
But also, they began using some kind of substance, the majority of them within a year of their first sexual abuse experience, regardless of age, to really help them with their own symptoms, to be able to feel or to numb, to experience that distance from the symptoms, the intrusive thoughts, feelings, and memories, or to be able to be more social. So they were really using substances and were able to identify specifically using substances to deal with their trauma symptoms.
It's a strategy that we use when we need it, right?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. And it works. And yes. Different substances, of course, work for different symptoms. Some substances work really well for those hypervigilant kinds of symptoms, the rage, the panic attacks, the flashbacks. And some substances work better for those numbing kinds of hypo symptoms, the symptoms of numbing or depression. And so people will use different substances for different kinds of trauma-related symptoms. Most substances then also make the PTSD symptoms worse. And so
Right.
it's a cyclical kind of experience.
Yeah, and it's also I find that a lot of times we'll shame ourselves for the strategies that we used, whether it was drugs or whether it was anger or being a perfect kid or whatever it is, that we often shame ourselves for that too.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
then shame, of course, becomes one of the biggest factors in preventing people from being able to access treatment. All those pieces of shame. And of course, trust, because they've often been betrayed by individual family members, by the system. It's so hard to reach out and ask for assistance when that hasn't been met in a helpful way.
So, were you finding when you were working with that population in particular that it was pretty much universal that they had had sexual abuse if they were working as prostitutes or sex workers?
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely. There are very few referrals that came into our program that didn't have a known history of sexual abuse. It did occasionally happen. We also got referrals through the hospital, through the ER, or through some other departments in the hospital. For instance, if somebody came in and was saying that they had a broken leg, and there was no broken leg, but there are other symptoms. And of course, ER docs don't have time to really do, to talk to people and spend the time that's required to find out what's going on. So then the clinicians in our practice were on call for the hospital 40 hours a week also. So there were occasionally people who didn't have a known history of sexual abuse, but they had so many different symptoms that kind of pointed to that they at least got into our program to begin.
Oh, okay.
We also had a number of people who were already affected by fetal alcohol syndrome, who in fact had the fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and then were more vulnerable to perpetration and were coming into our system. Of course, our therapy had to be quite different for that population. And so I learned to do all kinds of nonverbal therapies. And that really helped me as I began to learn about therapy that was much more effective for complex trauma dissociation. It really pointed me into the direction of art therapies and other nonverbal therapies like sensory motor psychotherapy and internal systems therapy and ego state therapy and all those different kinds of ways of interacting with people that are not kind of just the traditional talk
It seems like traditional talk therapy has its place, definitely, and it's not enough because trauma is very much a body experience.
therapy. That's right, it's a body experience and it's a sensory based experience. We all have our particular modes of things we like and things we don't like that are sensory particular. So, for instance, I am particular to smells. And one of the things that we found with trauma is that a person who is perpetrating trauma, if it's an individual kind of interpersonal trauma, they'll use the sense or senses that are provide them with the greatest sense of satisfaction. So, for instance, if they are really predominantly verbal, they may say things to the victim that enhance their level of satisfaction with the perpetration. And if the victim's mode of sensory based experience is the same as the perpetrator's, the trauma is actually quadrupled.
That makes sense.
Doesn't it? Yeah, and so we've learned that trauma is a sensory based experience. We cannot do trauma therapy without sensory based.
So, how would you work? Can you give an example of how you would work with that with somebody?
Yeah, sure. So I have most of my clients create what I call a comfort box. And in that comfort box, I ask them to write down, to make lists, first of all, to start with what do I like to smell, to see, to hear, to taste, to feel. And then whatever are items on that list that can actually go physically into the comfort box, I'll have them put those in. And then I have them put in memorabilia or letters from really important people that help them feel better, things they can go to when they're feeling overwhelmed, when they feel like they want to use a substance or want to cut or want to punch a wall or feel like running away or overeating or undereating restrictions. And those sensory-based items can be things that, first of all, we start in the therapy office.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll look, like I have essential oils in my office, and so we'll find maybe an essential oil that helps the person with grounding. And then use that in the office, and then I'll get a little sample for them to take home and put in their comfort box. And so we try and find at least one thing for each of the senses that they can carry with them to make a sort of emergency sensory-based kit that goes with them as you start to have a panic attack or a flashback or an experience of wanting to use. Then those are things that they can turn to help ground themselves and
Yeah, what a great idea. It's a very physical way to help with that downregulation
it is
of the nervous system.
And we're learning so much more about the bottom up kind of interventions with the brain. Bruce Perry and Dan Siegel, of course, have been really instrumental in helping us understand that and finding all kinds of ways. I have a sensory room in my clinic here, and so we have a trampoline, a big sensory chair people can sit in. You kind of block out a lot of the sensory input. We've got a full-size punching bag. We have an adult-sized sit and spin. All kinds of things we can do with the trauma-informed yoga and that sort of thing. So all of those become sensory interventions.
Well, and mentioning trauma-informed yoga too, yoga is such a complete practice for the body, the mind, the breath. And it's what I find is that a lot of people can't really access their body. And so something like a movement like yoga can help them even just to turn their head and feel the muscle move.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Sometimes it's important to start with things like that and not going to a more traditional yoga class.
Right.
To a trauma-informed yoga class. So they may stay in a chair the entire time. And the whole class may start out that way, and they may move to a mat or not. But for people where the body has actually been very traumatic or has betrayed them in some way, it's very hard to move into just doing body kinds of interventions. And it can make people feel like they're feeling all over again. We found that therapists used to think that we needed to help people relax. Well, that's great, but if relaxing makes you feel like you're unsafe, like you may be traumatized again, if somebody may take advantage of it doesn't feel safe to relax, and then people feel like, oh, I can't do it, and therapist thinks that this is what's going to help me, and I can't do that, and it just feel like a failure all over.
So that was what you were doing that's how you got started, but you're clearly still working in that same area now. So what does your practice look like now?
Yeah, so that was 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And now I am working with a group of like-minded people, all of whom have really a belief that it is the relationship between the therapist and the client that is what he is. And all of whom have training in EMDR and mini and sensory motor psychotherapy and different kinds of sensory-based interventions. And so I provide kind of the overall clinic supervision, and I also continue to see. So it's a private practice, an outpatient kind of mode. We do counseling of individual, family, couples, groups. We're looking at building some intensive sort of programs. In Alaska, even in Anchorage, we don't have any day treatment programs. No partial hospitalization programs. So we're really looking at trying to do some more intensive kind of interventions that are very holistic, try to integrate all these different pieces, and we'll see. We're just kind of in the beginning processes, but really focusing on folks with that complex trauma and dissociative processes.
So I know that you work with a lot of people who are in the Aboriginal community, the Native people there.
Yes.
And so how does that what are the there's been so much intergenerational trauma with Aboriginal people, and how does that obviously it affects everything.
It
But
does.
how do you work with that? Is it different? Is it the same? What kind of cultural supports are you working with? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, it is different, and it is also the same. You know,
Yeah.
and so, of course, it's also individualized. I mean, there are some individuals that I work with who've grown up here in Anchorage, and Anchorage is the largest city in Alaska. Some individuals that I work with who are in villages, and so the treatment can be very, very different. Um, Speaking sort of stereotypically, and I apologize for that, but in that way, one of the things that I look for is doing an assessment on how much assistance or how much support would they like from different family members. And sometimes the biggest difference I see is that um, it's much less likely that as Native people we want individual kinds of treatment, and much more likely that we're interested in having family-based or community-based sort of intervention, so that it's really encompassing something that is maybe a little bit different from the traditional Western kind of interventions. And so I really want people to feel like the treatment they're getting is something that matches what they're asking for. Sometimes that brings in spiritual practices. Sometimes I will work in conjunction with, say, a traditional healer or with a leader in the community. If I'm going into a First Nations or an Alaska Native or into Indian country, um, I want to ask permission first from the tribal government and from the chief or the leaders in that community to even be there. Depending on the age of the person, I may also ask for permission from elders in the family to be a part of that kind of intervention. And then
Mhm.
I was asking what kinds of things do they want to incorporate? What kinds of spiritual or traditional practices or cultural kinds of practices are important to them? I think that in any community, we sort of look for this, what's called in Native communities, Pan Indian. So we think, well, oh, so let's create dream catchers, or if you're sent to a dance group, maybe that will be enough. But it's not, because that's not what culture is. And one of the things that I have learned and that I try to incorporate in any kind of treatment that I do is that I really believe that cultural and sensory based interventions or bottom up kinds of brain interventions are so interconnected that they can't be disconnected. If you think about culture and you think about your own family situation, those things that are culture are also related to attachment. So, I have a story of when I was growing up. My mom always made fish head stew. I did not grow up in a traditional Native community, and this was very, um, my friends thought it was weird. They would come into the house, they thought it smelled funny. It was very embarrassing for me. I didn't even want to eat the fish head stew because there'd be eyeballs swimming around in this soup. But when I went to college and I called my mom, and I was just distraught and homesick, and I said, I really want you to send me some fish head stew. Because not only is there a certain taste, but there's a certain smell. There's a certain experience of what was happening in the kitchen when my mom was cooking this fish head stew. All kinds of cultural pieces that go along with how was the fish harvested, who was there when the fish was harvested, who helped cut that fish. And so all of those cultural pieces also have sensory based kinds of experiences attached to them. And when we think about things like adoption or children going into foster families, all of those different pieces are so impactful and can both increase trauma experienced by the person but also can be a part of the treatment and a part of healing. And so I think for me, that's one of the biggest pieces of whatever the culture is, looking at what are those sensory based and what are those attachment based experiences, and how can we make that meaningful and not just lip service. How can it be truly meaningful? Um, Sometimes in adoption and foster placements, when I'm asked to do assessments of the impact of culture versus attachment, one of the things I will say is you really can't separate those two.
Right.
It's so important to look at those two together, as well as the individual situation the person's in. But for instance, going to language class is not culture because it's there's so much more depth to learning a language. It's who's teaching, and who else is in the room, and what are you eating or smelling or drinking while you're learning the language. It's so much more comprehensive than going to a language class and thinking that they're guiding somebody with a cultural experience.
The language is important and it's related to culture, but it's not the whole thing.
Yeah.
One of my nieces is from around Inuvik in the Northwest Territories in Canada. She's Gwich'in. And she makes a big effort with her daughter as well as for herself to remain connected. And she goes up to her auntie's fish camp on the Mackenzie River and, just immerses in that because you don't get it otherwise.
You don't.
Yeah. So when you're working with addiction in a village, what would be some of the like if you go in with a certain person, there's like an identified person you're working with. And then what kind of work would the family do, the community do? Would everybody be working on it, or how does that look in order to address addiction?
Bring in different villages and with different families and different individuals. But again, I think the main difference is when I'm looking through a cultural lens, I I might be looking more at a community intervention. And so because there is independent sovereignty in many native communities, they may have a tribal government that is able to intervene in ways that is actually much more, I guess you could say, intrusive, but also effective in ways that really look at holding an individual accountable, but also support them. So it can be much less punitive based and much more community based in terms of what does this individual have to offer to our community and how can our community support them. So, for instance, I've been involved in looking at relapse prevention for an individual in which the entire traditional council was involved in looking at that relapse prevention plan and identifying people who would be support persons in different ways for this individual, different people who are willing to report back, for instance, to, in this case, a probation officer, but also people who are willing to take on different kinds of support roles, and people who are willing to step in when they saw the cycle begin and knew where to intervene because that meant that this individual might be more likely to use their substance.
So that's the exact opposite of the shaming, shunning, isolation cycle.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, we know with the addiction cycle that shame is one of the things that is can lead to the use of alcohol or other substances.
Is it mostly alcohol abuse, or is there a lot of? I know in Canada there's so much around fentanyl overdoses and the whole opioid crisis. Is that pretty much the same in Alaska?
We're starting to see a lot more opiate kinds of issues, some heroin, some the meth. It's different in different communities, but we are starting to see. Alaska tends to be behind. We're starting to see some of those same kinds of things that you might see in what we call the lower 48. But of course, there's pockets in different places of Alaska, and so the interventions might be quite different in different pockets of different places in Alaska.
So, what's your sense of, when you work with someone, what's your sense of what it is that, and I don't know if it's easy to describe this, but what is it that allows one person to really go deeply in and recover? It takes so much courage to do that work. What's your sense of what that's about, and what you can support in that to help people with that? You've already talked about some of it with safety and things, right?
And I do think that shame is such a component there. That, having somebody who can witness the shame,
Mhm.
and having somebody who the individual really feels respects them and can honor their coping mechanisms, can see those for what they are, and can help them to then kind of honor those parts of themselves and honor the way that they needed to cope. I do think that addressing that shame is such a huge, huge part of being able to then move into the deeper work. I really don't think we can do the deepest work without moving past and having to address that shame. And of course, in order to do that, we have to have that firm foundation of, a relationship with the provider or whoever the support person is. And of course, that first kind of safety and stabilization. Safety and stabilization for somebody who's also experienced chronic or developmental trauma may take a much longer period of time than for somebody who hasn't. And somebody who's experienced trauma, for instance, in their adulthood, but had a very strong connection or a strong attachment or, good enough attachment with their primary caregiver.
It's becoming increasingly clear that it's not just about the events that happen to us. It's really about developmental trauma and our relationships, the attachments, all of that stuff frames it differently somehow.
Yeah, right. When you look at addiction, one of those cycles that can happen is we have parents who are using substances. Because they're using substances, they're not able to do that healthy attachment with their child. And that child then experiences a difficulty right from the beginning. And if you're experiencing a difficulty, you have that attachment that comes along with a frightening or a frightened caregiver, right? Then it's very hard to establish that sense of safety from the beginning. And that, of course, becomes how we view the world and how we view ourselves and how we view other people in the world. And so to come right from the very beginning from a place of fear or needing to protect myself or care for the self, feeling like other people aren't going to do that for me, then that really sets a foundation that makes any kind of additional trauma after that much more difficult to tolerate and to heal.
Yeah, and it kind of reinforces that core beliefs that people might have that they're not worthy of being protected, they're not lovable. There's so many distressing beliefs that we tune into when we have those experiences.
Yes.
Yeah. What do you see as some key principles and strengths for people to focus on to support them in their recovery? So, if someone's listening, either with an addiction problem themselves or with someone that they love who's got an addiction issue, what are the first few things that people really need to focus in on?
To be able to then access treatment and kind of the foundation for being able to heal and to quit using substances. Is that?
Yeah, and also on a kind of a personal level as well. You talked about attachment, you've talked about safety. So, just from your experience, obviously, it's really wonderful if people can access some treatment, and so that would be a priority. What comes to mind when you think about that? Whatever you comes to mind is fine.
So I really think healing, think of healing as something that is multifaceted. Although I'm a therapist, I don't think that therapy, especially talk therapy, is the only mode of healing. I have learned from some of my elders that there's 7 different types of healing, and those are walking, singing, sweating, laughing, crying. talking, and screaming. And those are things that we sometimes don't actually, as therapists, we don't endorse. I think all of those are really important, to get out in nature and be able to let go of some things. To go take a sauna or a banya and sweat out the toxins. To be able to talk with somebody else, but to also be able to cry, to be able to shake. And that really speaks, I think from a traditional or from a indigenous kind of healing perspective, it really speaks to moving that energy and moving those blocked kinds of resources out of our body from the times that we were traumatized. We really have to metabolize that trauma out of our body. And I do believe that as Indigenous peoples, we have known for centuries, for many, many generations, ways of healing that, in fact, we're just beginning now with these multi-million-dollar research studies to find are, in fact, actual ways of healing because somehow some people have not recognized that there is a neck between our mind and our body. There is, in fact, a brain-body kind of connection. I think all of those things are ways of healing. I think writing is a way of healing. All kinds of art are ways of healing. And I do think that it is imperative to have a relationship with one other person to help in that support process. And that person doesn't necessarily have to be a professional. It needs to be somebody who will hold us accountable. Somebody who is maybe a cheerleader for us or a mentor for us. Or maybe somebody who, is more like a coach and really kind of kicks our butt. Different for everyone. Of course, if you can have all of those different kinds of people in your life, you'll have an even better chance. So I really do think looking for different types of support is incredibly important. Not just as individuals healing, but also as practitioners and as healers and as helpers. That we need to have that support in our lives as well.
And the role of the community is so important in that. Yeah, and it's different in a city than it would be in a small community too. Cities tend to have their own little microcosms, but generally speaking, people can be a lot more isolated.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Much more isolated in such a bigger community. And,
Mhm.
in bigger communities, we also tend to look for those kind of, how do I want to say it, industrialized or kind of made resources, more resources that are professional resources. It can be helpful in so many ways. But sometimes, when you're in a smaller community, you can actually have resources that are much more, in fact, comprehensive and helpful because you have people who know you, who are committed to you, or if not you, to your family, or to the family name, or to maybe some family member who holds a position in the community. And because of those roles, they may be willing to do things outside the box that professionals couldn't do. And they may be able to provide a much more comprehensive treatment that could actually be much more helpful than what we think of as professional kinds of interventions. Perhaps much more helpful to that individual or helpful maybe just in a different way. But there are different resources. We sometimes think that there are no resources in some of our smaller communities. I think there are immense resources. They just aren't paid resources. There are those professional resources, but there are all kinds of resources.
Well, and then the whole community is involved in the healing. It's a joint effort with a bunch of people, and then it's so crucial for the person with addiction because it's so isolating. And there's so much shame around having an addiction and loser and all of that stuff. To have that inclusion in a community who cares about you.
And the secondary benefit is that it's actually quite healing for the communities. For all the people who are providing the support and providing the assistance. We heal along with the people. When kind of in graduate school, that's a big no-no. But in fact, I don't believe that human beings, that people can provide assistance without actually getting something. That it is a reciprocal relationship in many ways. And sometimes as professionals, we tend to deny that or to maybe minimize that. And in more traditional or indigenous communities, that doesn't occur so much. So that's one really beautiful benefit to being able to do the community work.
You know, the thing about addiction and recovery is that we have to work with trauma, right? And so that was a natural fit to kind of look at some of the people that were working with trauma and addiction. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And historically has been so separated and divided.
Yeah.
I think we're getting a little bit better, but a lot of the little bit better that we're getting is still sort of lip service.
Right.
And talking about integrated services, but not really integrating services.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I love
Yeah, there's some big shifts that still have to happen in the way people think about addiction and addicts and medical, criminal. There's a whole range of things that have to change.
right.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much. It's been wonderful talking with you and hearing about your program. And yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah. Have a wonderful day
Yes,
and
you
good
too.
luck on all of this summit. It's really a wonderful thing.
Go to killibycenter.com, Radical Recovery Summit, to see the full schedule of speakers and to register to watch these free online September 23rd and 24th in the Radical Recovery Summit 2017.